The sun was beginning to dip below the western horizon, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked land. The wind had picked up, sending dust swirling through the streets of Rustler's Ridge, and Maddox, the rancher, could feel the weight of the evening settling in. He stood outside his cabin, looking out over the land he had worked for years to build, his weathered hands resting on the handle of a rifle slung over his shoulder. The world had been quiet, too quiet, but in this part of the country, silence often meant trouble. Maddox had seen it all in his time on the ranch. The rustlers, the droughts, the fleeting moments of peace that never seemed to last. But today, something felt different. Something was coming. He didn't know what it was, but it was drawing closer, like a storm gathering on the horizon. As if on cue, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. A rider appeared on the dusty trail leading up to his ranch. The figure was small but determined, the horse pounding its hooves against the earth like a warning bell. The rider was a woman, her dark silhouette framed against the dying light of the day. She was riding fast, like someone running from something, her long, dark hair flying behind her like a banner in the wind. Maddox squinted into the distance, his eyes narrowing. He had seen his fair share of strangers come and go over the years, but this woman, there was something different about her. She didn't fit the usual mold of travelers who passed through Rustler's Ridge. Most were drifters, the occasional outlaw, or ranch hands looking for work. This woman, she wasn't like them. She rode up to the gate of the ranch and pulled her horse to a sharp stop, dust billowing in the air as she dismounted in one fluid motion. Her boots hit the ground with a thud, and she stood there for a moment, catching her breath, her eyes scanning the area like she was expecting someone to be waiting for her. Her clothes were fine, not the sort of thing you'd expect someone to be wearing out here on the frontier. She looked out of place, like a lady who had wandered too far from the city and was now stuck in a world that didn't make sense to her. Maddox didn't move immediately. He was always cautious around strangers, especially women who came riding in out of nowhere. It wasn't like him to offer help without knowing more, but something about this woman's presence had him intrigued. He could tell by the way she carried herself that she wasn't some innocent traveler. She took a few steps toward him, her face set with determination, her posture straight. She didn't seem tired from the ride. Instead, there was a kind of fire in her that kept her moving, even when every part of her should have been exhausted. She met his gaze without flinching, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but urgent. "You're Maddox, right?" He nodded, keeping his hand close to the rifle at his side. "I am. What brings you here, miss?" The woman took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached up to brush a lock of hair from her face. There was fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that came from running from something, or someone, much bigger than you could handle. "I need your help," she said, her voice low and strained. "And I need it now." Maddox didn't move. He studied her closely, trying to read the situation. She was wearing a fine dress, but it was dirt-streaked, torn at the hem. Her boots were scuffed, and there were signs of wear on her clothing that suggested she had been traveling for days. "I'm not one to offer help to strangers on a whim," Maddox said, his voice gruff. "You'll need to tell me more than that." The woman swallowed, and for the first time, Maddox saw the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't here for some casual conversation. She wasn't here to ask for food or water. There was something urgent in the way she carried herself, like she had no other choice but to come to him. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, taking a step forward. "I need you to marry me." Maddox's eyebrows shot up. "Marry you?" "Yes, I need a husband. Fast," she said, her voice almost pleading now. "I'm offering you $10,000. You stand beside me at the altar, keep your mouth shut, and after that, you can forget you ever saw me." Maddox stared at her, his hand loosening its grip on the rifle. $10,000. It wasn't a small sum, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was more money than most men could dream of in their lifetime. The offer was tempting, but it also didn't sit right with him. Why would a woman like her, someone who didn't look like she belonged anywhere near a ranch, show up asking for a man to marry her for money? And why did she seem so desperate? "You don't know me," Maddox said, his voice more pointed now. "Why me?" Her eyes flickered to the ground for a moment, her jaw tightening. When she looked back up, her expression was hard, like she had made her decision and wasn't going to back down now. "Because I don't have a choice," she said quietly. "Because they're after me. And if I don't do this, I won't be alive to see another day." Maddox felt his pulse quicken. The way she said it, the way her eyes dropped to the ground as if she couldn't bear to look at him anymore, made him believe her. This wasn't just some woman looking for a quick, easy way out. This was a woman on the run. But the rancher wasn't an easy man to convince. His life had always been his own, and the last thing he needed was to get tangled up in someone else's problems. His ranch, his work, had always come first, and he had seen too many women come and go, too many false promises and broken hearts to take a stranger's word at face value. "I don't know you, lady," Maddox said, his voice hardening, "and I don't get involved in things I don't understand." But even as he said it, something in his gut told him that this wasn't a decision he could walk away from. She had come to him for help not because she wanted something easy, but because she was willing to do whatever it took to survive. She stepped closer, her face tense with fear, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't have time to explain everything, but I swear to you, if you don't do this, if you turn me away, you'll regret it. They won't stop, and I won't be the only one who pays the price." Maddox stared at her for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched between them, and all he could hear was the sound of his own breath and the distant cry of a hawk in the sky. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it, but don't think for a second that this means I trust you." The woman's face softened slightly, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what this means." Maddox stood there, staring at her as the sun dipped lower in the sky. He had made a choice, and now there was no going back. But as he looked into her eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. The ranch stretched out before Maddox like an endless sea of grass, dotted with scattered boulders and grazing cattle. But in the fading light of evening, his thoughts were far from the land he had worked for so many years. The decision he had just made felt like a weight settling deep in his chest. He had agreed to marry a woman he knew nothing about, a woman who, with nothing more than a desperate look in her eyes and an offer of $10,000, had somehow convinced him to join her in this strange pact. But the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. Why had she come to him? What was she running from? And most importantly, why had she come to him? A rancher who had spent most of his life with his head buried in the dirt, working the land, minding his business. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, had given him only the barest details of her situation. She had claimed to be running from someone or something, but who? And why had she chosen him, of all people, to stand beside her at the altar? It didn't make sense. Maddox rubbed his face with a hand that still felt the roughness of the day's work. He was used to tough decisions, but this was different. It wasn't about cattle or land, or even money. It was about something much more personal. He had crossed a line, and in the stillness of the night, he wondered if he had made a mistake. A sound from the door broke his thoughts. The woman stepped into the cabin, her presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. She was dressed in the same fine clothes, though now they were worn and dirty from the long ride. Her face, which had been tense earlier, seemed more relaxed now, though there was still a trace of worry behind her eyes. She had the look of someone who had been running for a long time, and even though she stood there before him, she seemed like she was already somewhere else. "I thought you might be hungry," Maddox said, his voice gruff. He didn't know why he had said it, but there was something about her that made him want to make her feel more at ease, even if just for a moment. She nodded, her gaze flicking to the small kitchen area. "I'm fine," she said quickly, "but I appreciate it." There was an awkward pause between them, neither knowing what to say next. The silence stretched long, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Maddox broke the silence. "So, what's the deal? Exactly?" he asked, his voice blunt. "Why me? Why now?" The woman looked at him, her expression softening. She took a step closer, her eyes locking with his. There was no longer the same frantic edge to her. Instead, there was something more resigned, as though she had accepted that the choices she had made had led her to this point. "I told you I was running," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But I didn't tell you why. I didn't tell you what kind of people I'm running from, what kind of men they are." Maddox folded his arms across his chest. "I'm listening." She nodded and sighed, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders as if seeking comfort in its warmth. "It's not just money, Maddox. It's power, control. These men, they don't just want money. They want to control everything. And I was supposed to be the key to that control. They needed me to marry one of their own, to bind me to them. They thought I'd do it, but I didn't. I didn't give them what they wanted. And now..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, as though the weight of her past was too much to bear in that moment. Maddox stood there, processing her words. There was something about her, something more than just fear or desperation. It was a sense of power, of defiance, that seemed to burn through her even now. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't just about survival. It was about freedom. The freedom to make her own choices, even when the consequences could cost her everything. "What happens if you don't marry me?" he asked, his voice steady. She met his gaze, her expression hardening. "If I don't marry someone, if I don't marry tonight, they'll find me. And when they do, they won't stop until they get what they want. And I won't be the only one who pays for it. People will die." Maddox felt a chill run through him. He had known she was running from something dangerous, but now the magnitude of it hit him all at once. He wasn't just agreeing to a marriage of convenience. He was stepping into the middle of something dark and dangerous, and whatever it was bigger than he had imagined. "You think they'll come after you here?" he asked, his voice low. "To my ranch?" She nodded, the faintest tremor in her hands as she crossed her arms in front of her. "They won't stop. They've already sent someone after me, and they know where I am. They always know where I am. They'll come for me, but they'll come for you, too. Anyone who's helped me, anyone who stood in their way." She stopped and swallowed hard. "They'll make you pay for it. They'll make everyone pay." Maddox felt his stomach tighten. The weight of her words was like a stone in his gut. He had known trouble before, but this was something entirely different. This was the kind of trouble that could ruin everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. "I don't know who these people are, but I'm not some damn pawn," Maddox said, his voice edged with anger. "You don't just come to my place, make a deal, and expect me to keep quiet about it. I'm not some hired hand. I've got my own life, my own business to tend to." The woman's face softened slightly, and she took a step closer to him. "I'm not asking you to be silent forever," she said, her voice softer now. "I just need your help for one night. One night, and then you can go back to your life. You'll never hear from me again." Maddox felt the weight of her words, and for a moment, he considered walking away. He considered telling her to leave, to get off his land and go wherever it was she had come from. But something in him wouldn't let him do it. The woman was right, this wasn't just a simple offer. It was bigger than both of them. He looked at her for a long moment, his mind working through the implications of everything she had said. If I do this, I want answers, he said, his voice firm. I'm not standing in front of a preacher for anyone, unless I know exactly what I'm walking into. She nodded, her gaze never leaving his. I'll tell you everything, but you have to promise me one thing. Promise me you'll keep your word. Promise me you'll stand with me. Maddox didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't sure he could promise that. He wasn't sure that standing with her was something he could do without consequences. But in the end, he knew there was no turning back. She had already dragged him into this mess, and there was no escaping it now. I'll stand with you, he said, his voice low and firm. But you need to understand something. If they come for me, I won't back down. I'll fight. I'll protect what's mine. She gave a small, weary smile, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she had arrived. I wouldn't expect anything less. The next morning, Maddox and the woman made their way to the small chapel at the edge of town. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light over the world. It was a beautiful day, and for a brief moment, Maddox almost forgot what was at stake. But the woman's nervous energy reminded him that everything was hanging in the balance. When they arrived at the chapel, Maddox could feel the tension in the air. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew that this moment, this decision, would change everything. The ranch had always been Maddox's sanctuary, his refuge. For years, he had lived in the quiet rhythm of daily life, the long hours spent on horseback, the sweat and grit of hard work, the simple satisfaction of growing a small piece of land into something worthwhile. He had been content. That was, until she had ridden into his life like a windstorm, a woman with a broken past and a future that was running out. Now, standing in the small chapel, he felt that same sense of peace slipping away, replaced by something heavier, something more uncertain. The woman, whose name he still hadn't asked, stood beside him. She wasn't a bride in any sense that made sense to him. She wasn't dressed in white. There were no joyous smiles or hopeful glances, only a tension that could be felt in the very air around them. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. She was a woman with no other option, and yet here she was, binding herself to a man she barely knew, all in the name of survival. Maddox had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change forever. The preacher's voice broke through the quiet. He had been waiting patiently at the altar, a slight frown on his weathered face. "We're gathered here today to unite these two souls in matrimony," he began, his words deliberate, but there was a certain hesitance in his tone, as though he himself didn't quite understand what was happening. Maddox didn't want to look at her. He didn't want to acknowledge the trembling woman standing beside him, a stranger wrapped in fear and desperation. But there she was. The weight of her presence pressed against him, thick with unspoken words, and Maddox couldn't help but notice the way her hands shook as she held the bouquet of wild flowers. It was strange, unsettling. A woman, once unknown to him, now about to become his wife, at least on paper. The preacher turned to him. "Maddox, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health?" Maddox stood there, his heart beating louder than it had in years. He couldn't focus on the preacher's words, not when everything felt so wrong. He hadn't planned on getting married. Hell, he hadn't even planned on spending his life with anyone but his land. But here he was. His mind raced. He wanted to speak, to explain, to refuse. But the fear in the woman's eyes kept him still. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the strange offer. It was about her. She was asking for something bigger, something that transcended the simple promise of a piece of paper and a vow. Maddox finally managed to speak, his voice low and gravelly. "I do." The words left his mouth, and even as he said them, he couldn't believe it. This was madness, and yet there was no turning back now. The woman beside him didn't look at him. She merely stared ahead, her face unreadable. The preacher nodded and turned to the woman. "And do you, woman, Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband." For a long moment, she didn't speak. She didn't even move. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, as the weight of the moment settled around them. She had come to him in desperation, asking for his help. She had offered him money, offered him a way out of this situation. But it wasn't the money that mattered. Not anymore. This wasn't about a deal anymore. This was about survival. "I do," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile, that Maddox had to strain to hear it. But it was enough. The preacher's eyes softened, and he stepped back, offering a final prayer of blessing. "By the power vested in me by the Lord and the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Maddox froze. The moment stretched before him like an eternity. His hand hovered over the woman's, unsure. But there was something inside of him, something that told him to proceed, to finish what had been started. The air around them felt heavy, and Maddox could feel the weight of the situation more than ever. The kiss wasn't some romantic gesture. There was no passion in it. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of what had just been done. With slow, deliberate movement, Maddox leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead, gentle but firm. The kiss was cold, distant. There was no affection in it, no joy, no promise. There was only the grim reality of what had been set in motion. The preacher nodded, his face unreadable. "Go in peace," he said softly, stepping aside as if the whole thing had left him exhausted. Maddox couldn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. There was no celebration, no joy. This was just a formality, a necessary step in a game that was much bigger than either of them. They were bound now, whether they liked it or not. The woman turned away, her hands clutching the bouquet, as though it were the only thing holding her together. Maddox followed her out of the chapel, the soft light of dawn spilling into the room behind them. He could see the fear in her every movement. This wasn't a bride walking out of a chapel, it was a woman on the run, a woman who had just made an irreversible decision. As they exited the church, the sun had barely risen. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, but the beauty of the morning felt lost on him. There was no time for beauty. There was only the harsh reality of what had just happened. "We need to leave," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder, as though she was afraid someone might be following them already. "Now?" Maddox nodded, but a question lingered in the air between them. "Where do we go?" She paused for a moment, looking out at the land surrounding the chapel. "I have a cabin. It's up north, near the mountains. It's isolated enough that they won't find us right away. But we have to move fast." The urgency in her voice was undeniable. Maddox had no idea who they were, but the way she spoke made it clear that they were dangerous. Whoever these men were, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and she had made it clear that what they wanted was her. Without another word, Maddox mounted his horse, and the woman did the same. They rode out of the small town, leaving behind the chapel, the preacher, and the strange quiet that had settled over Rustler's Ridge. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grasses and sending the faint scent of rain into the air. Maddox could feel the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no idea what kind of danger they were headed toward, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. As they rode, the woman didn't speak. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight. There was a tightness to her posture that told Maddox she was still running from something, running from a past she couldn't outrun. And he was caught in it, whether he liked it or not. After an hour of riding, the land began to change. The flat, open plains gave way to rugged hills and sparse forests. The road narrowed, and the trees grew taller, their branches reaching out like claws. Maddox had been in these parts before, but never with such a sense of urgency. The mountains were not far now. The woman glanced over at him, her face a mix of exhaustion and fear. "I'm sorry you're caught up in this," she said softly. "I never meant for you to get involved." Maddox's gaze stayed fixed ahead. "You didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "And neither do I." She didn't respond, but he could feel the weight of her words between them. He hadn't chosen this, but he had made the decision to stand by her. And now they were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. But Maddox wasn't sure what that meant. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. "We'll be safe for now," she said, her voice distant. "But we can't stay in one place for too long. We need to keep moving." Maddox nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The storm clouds in the distance were growing darker, and the wind picked up. There was something in the air, something that made him uneasy. The danger they were running from wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real, and soon it would catch up to them. They reached the cabin as the first raindrops began to fall. The small building was nestled against the side of a hill, hidden away from view. The windows were dark, but there was a faint light coming from the chimney. The woman dismounted first, her movements quick and efficient. She didn't wait for Maddox as she moved to the door, unlocking it with a quick motion. "Come inside," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. Maddox followed her inside, stepping into the warmth of the cabin. It was small but cozy, the fire crackling in the hearth casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but there was a sense of comfort in the simplicity. A bed in the corner, a table with a few chairs, and a shelf lined with books and odds and ends. The woman didn't waste any time. She moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. "We won't be safe here for long," she said, her voice tight with tension. "They'll be looking for us." Maddox stood by the door, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could protect them both from whatever was chasing her. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. The woman turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the weight of the situation seemed to lift. And for the first time since they had met, Maddox saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Trust. It was fleeting, but it was there. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Maddox allowed himself to believe that they might actually make it through this. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it together. The sky had darkened rapidly as they made their way to the cabin. The wind had picked up, swirling the dry earth into small clouds of dust, a foreboding sign of what was to come. Maddox could feel it in the air, the heaviness, the electric tension that pulsed around them, the quiet before a storm. But it wasn't just the weather that weighed on his mind. It was everything that had led them to this moment, everything that had brought them to the edge of this mountain, hiding from whatever or whoever was coming after them. The woman, still unnamed to Maddox, moved with a sense of urgency as she opened the door to the small cabin. She had barely spoken since they left the chapel. The only sounds had been the rhythmic pounding of their horses' hooves on the ground and the occasional gust of wind pushing against them. Maddox had kept his thoughts to himself, his mind racing, trying to figure out what came next. They were both in this now, together, and somehow, he knew that the quiet moments of their ride would soon give way to something much darker. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeted them. The soft crackling sound filled the room, the only thing that seemed to offer any comfort in the midst of the cold, harsh world outside. The cabin was small but sturdy, built to withstand the isolation of the mountain. It was far from a luxurious refuge, but it offered something that Maddox knew he wouldn't find anywhere else: safety, or at least, the illusion of safety. The woman moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The flickering light from the fire cast shadows on her face, making her seem even more fragile than she already appeared. She was still tense, her body coiled like a spring, waiting for something. But what? Who was chasing her? And why had she come to him, a rancher with nothing to offer except his name and a hard-earned life? Maddox couldn't stand the silence any longer. "What now?" he asked, his voice low, a little rough. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from the long ride that weighed on him. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that this moment was just a temporary reprieve, not an end. She turned to face him, her eyes dark and weary. "Now we wait," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the crackling fire. "They'll be looking for us, and they'll find us if we're not careful." Maddox felt his gut tighten. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was the defiance. She wasn't just running. She was fighting. But fighting what? Who were these people who were after her? And why had they pursued her all the way to his doorstep? "They won't stop," she added, her voice hardening, as if the very thought of them sent a chill down her spine. "They'll search every inch of this land. If they find us, they'll make sure we never leave." Maddox looked at her, the weight of her words pressing on him. He had agreed to this, agreed to marry her, not out of love or desire, but out of a sense of duty. She had asked for help, and he had given it. Now, the consequences of that decision were starting to settle in. He had no idea what he was involved in, but he wasn't backing down. "Not now. We can't stay here forever," he said. "We need a plan. We can't keep running." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze sharp, as if she were seeing him for the first time. Then, she nodded, slowly, as if weighing the options in her mind. "I know, but we don't have much time. They're closing in." Maddox could feel it too. The oppressive weight of their situation was thick in the cabin, filling the space like a dense fog. The walls, which had once seemed to offer shelter, now felt like they were closing in around him. They were trapped for now, but Maddox knew that wouldn't last. Whatever was chasing her, whatever danger was lurking just beyond the edge of the world, would eventually find them. And when it did, it would come with a fury that neither of them was ready for. He glanced toward the door, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle resting against the wall. He had lived through many dangerous situations, but this felt different. There was something in the air, something almost palpable, like a storm waiting to break. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew it was going to be bad. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Who are these people? Why are they after you?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to the window, staring out at the storm clouds gathering in the distance. The rain was still a few miles away, but the winds had already shifted, bringing with them the cold bite of the mountains. "They're not just men," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're part of something much bigger, a network of men who think they can control everything. They've been in charge for years, pulling strings, making deals, controlling people like pawns. And I was supposed to be their queen." Maddox felt a chill run through him. "A queen?" he repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. "What does that mean?" She turned away from the window, her face pale, the weight of the past years pressing down on her. "I was born into this life, Maddox. My family wasn't always poor. We had land, wealth, influence. But those men, they came for us. They took everything we had, and when my father refused to comply with their demands, She stopped, her words choking in her throat. "They took my father. They killed him. And they took everything else, my family's land, the money, and then they came for me. They wanted me to marry one of them. They thought that if they controlled me, they could control everything else. But I refused. I ran." Maddox's mind raced. He had known nothing of this, nothing of her past. All he had known was the woman who had shown up on his doorstep, a stranger in need. But this was something else entirely. These men weren't just outlaws or criminals. They were organized, powerful, and ruthless. "And now they want you dead?" Maddox asked, his voice hard. "They want me alive," she replied, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "They want me to do their bidding, but I won't. I'll never give in. I'd rather die than let them control me. Maddox stood there, stunned. He had no idea how to respond. This wasn't just a runaway bride story. This was a tale of power, betrayal, and a fight for survival. A fight that had come to his doorstep. They won't stop, she said again, this time with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. But we can't just keep running forever. We need to strike first. Maddox's hand moved toward the rifle again, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. But he wasn't going to stand by and let these men take everything from him, either. If this was a fight, then he would fight. All right, he said, his voice low. We'll strike. But we need a plan. We can't just wait for them to come to us. She nodded. I know a place. A hidden cabin farther up the mountain. It's more isolated than this one. We can stock up on supplies, make our stand there. They won't expect it. Maddox felt the tension in his body loosen just slightly. At least there was a plan. We'll leave tonight, he said, before the storm hits. If we wait too long, we'll be caught. She nodded again. Her eyes narrowed with focus. I'll gather what we need. As she turned to prepare, Maddox stepped to the window, staring out into the growing storm. The wind howled through the trees, and the first raindrops began to fall, splattering against the window like tiny beads of glass. He had never felt so out of control in his life. He was about to leave everything behind: his ranch, his land, everything he had worked for, and for what? To protect a woman he had only just met. A woman with a past so dark that it threatened to swallow them both whole. But Maddox knew one thing. He wasn't going to run anymore. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with it. They would make their stand. They would fight. And when the storm came, they would face it head on. The storm had swept through the mountains, and now, as the wind howled, it left behind a heavy, oppressive silence. The sky above was filled with dark clouds, casting a shadow over the ridge that Maddox and Emma had made their last stand. The world felt hollow, the distant rumble of thunder lingering like the promise of something worse. Maddox was crouched behind a large boulder, the jagged rocks forming a natural barricade that shielded them from view. His heart was pounding in his chest, the tension in his muscles like the pull of a bowstring. He could hear the soft patter of raindrops falling on the earth, the sound of the forest around him muted by the storm's fury. The ground beneath him was slick, the wet soil making it hard to keep his footing, but he didn't dare move. He could feel Emma beside him, her breath slow and steady, matching his own as they both waited. The distant sound of hooves echoed through the mountain pass. Maddox's fingers tightened around his rifle. His eyes darted over the landscape, scanning the trees for any movement. They had come this far, surviving the storm, escaping the chapel, and now they were here on the edge of everything. The final fight was upon them. How many? He whispered, his voice low but urgent. Emma, crouched beside him, her hand resting on her own rifle, didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her focus sharp. I count 4, she said, her voice steady, though it carried an undercurrent of tension. Maybe more. Maddox nodded, though he hadn't expected anything less. He had heard the sound of their approach earlier, the familiar rhythm of horses galloping across the rough terrain, and he had known they were close. But there was no turning back now. No more running. They had made their choice, and whatever happened next, it would determine everything. They're close, Emma muttered under her breath, her gaze flicking to the trees at the far edge of their cover. When they get within range, we strike. Maddox nodded again, his fingers tight around the rifle's grip. His mind was sharp, his instincts honed by years of working the land. He wasn't a soldier, but he had fought before, and now he was fighting for his life and hers. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt, only action. The sound of the riders grew louder, their hooves thudding against the muddy earth. The rain was still coming down, but it hadn't slowed them. These men, whoever they were, had the determination of predators. Maddox could almost feel the tension in the air as they neared. They weren't just after Emma. They were after everything she had left. He looked at her again, his gaze softening for a brief moment. Emma's face was grim, her expression hard with resolve. He had seen that look before in the face of someone who had nothing left to lose. And though he knew she had made her peace with her fate, it didn't change the fact that he wasn't ready to lose her. Not now. Not after everything. The riders were almost upon them now, their horses barely visible through the thick mist that hung in the air. Emma shifted beside him, preparing to move. Maddox's hand hovered over the trigger of his rifle, his eyes locked on the riders as they drew closer. "Now," Emma said, her voice calm but forceful. "Take them out." Maddox didn't hesitate. He swung out from behind the boulder, his rifle raised, and fired. The first rider crumpled from his horse, falling to the ground in a heap, his body rolling with the momentum of his fall. The other riders immediately pulled their guns, firing in return. The crack of gunfire shattered the stillness, and Maddox's heart skipped a beat. He ducked back behind the boulder just as a bullet whizzed past him, the sound of it cutting through the air like a whisper of death. He could hear Emma firing, her shots sharp and precise, but the riders weren't backing down. They weren't just random outlaws. These men were well-trained, disciplined. The ground shook with the sound of hooves as the riders split up, trying to flank them. Maddox's eyes darted across the terrain, his pulse racing. They were good, but Maddox was better. He knew this land. He knew how to fight. And as the next rider came into view, Maddox fired again, his shot striking the man in the shoulder. The rider screamed, but he stayed mounted, swerving to the side to take cover. "We need to get to higher ground," Emma shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They're going to surround us." Maddox didn't waste time. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a nearby ridge. The path up the mountain narrow and slippery with rain. The rocks were jagged, but they gave them the advantage of height. From here, they could see the riders below, circling like wolves, waiting for an opening. The sound of the storm mixed with the crack of gunfire as Maddox and Emma scrambled up the path, their footsteps heavy in the wet mud. Maddox glanced over his shoulder, seeing the riders closing in. One of them was still on horseback, but the others were dismounted, trying to cut off their escape. "You take the left," Maddox called to Emma, his voice urgent. "I'll cover the right." We split them up. Emma nodded without hesitation. They had worked together before, during their time on the run, but this was different. This was a fight for their lives. Maddox took his position behind a large rock, his rifle raised. His eyes narrowed as the riders approached, their faces hidden by the mist. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body tense as he waited for them to make their move. The first rider appeared from the fog, his silhouette barely visible in the storm. Maddox aimed, steadying his breath. He fired. The rider screamed, falling from his horse. But another rider immediately took his place. Emma's shots rang out from the left, taking down another rider who had tried to flank them. Maddox's heart raced as he took aim at the next man. But before he could fire, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled backward. The rain had made the rocks slick, and his footing was slipping. The rider lunged, swinging his rifle toward Maddox, but Maddox was quicker. He ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the blow, and brought his rifle up. The shot rang out, hitting the rider square in the chest. The man crumpled, falling to the ground in a heap. Maddox's breath was coming in short gasps, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Emma was still firing, her shots precise, each one finding its mark. But there were more of them, more than Maddox had anticipated. He could hear the sound of more horses approaching, their hooves pounding the earth with a rhythm that was almost deafening. "We need to move, now," Emma shouted, her voice strained with effort. "They'll be here any second." Maddox nodded, his mind racing. He had no idea how many more men were out there. but he knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They had to keep moving. He reached for Emma's hand, pulling her toward him as the sounds of the riders grew louder. They had no choice but to run, to leave their cover and face the storm head-on. As they sprinted down the ridge, the riders pursued, closing in behind them. The path was steep, and Maddox could hear the sound of horses following them, the growls of the men echoing through the trees. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. If they did, it would be over. They reached a narrow pass between two large boulders, the walls closing in on them. Maddox glanced over his shoulder, seeing the riders almost upon them. They had no more time. Now, Maddox shouted, pulling Emma to the side. The riders had charged ahead, thinking they had cornered them. But Maddox had planned for this. He knew the terrain. He knew the angles. And now, they would have their chance to turn the tables. He stood, his rifle aimed, waiting for the first rider to come into view. When he did, Maddox fired, taking him down instantly. The other riders hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected attack. That was all Maddox needed. He and Emma fired together, cutting down the remaining riders one by one. The last rider was almost upon them when Emma fired, her shot striking him in the leg. The rider screamed, falling from his horse. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. Maddox stepped forward, rifle raised, ready to end it. But Emma's voice stopped him. "Don't kill him," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "We need answers." Maddox hesitated, his finger resting on the trigger. "Why? He's one of them." "I know," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But we need to know who's behind this. We need to know what they want." Reluctantly, Maddox lowered his rifle. The rider, now on the ground, groaned in pain but made no attempt to escape. Emma approached him slowly, her voice cold. "Who sent you?" she demanded. The rider spat blood onto the ground, his face twisted in pain and defiance. "You'll never know," he muttered through gritted teeth. "They'll come for you, all of you. They always do." Emma stepped closer, her eyes flashing with fury. "Tell me who sent you, or I'll make sure you never walk again." The rider's eyes flickered to Maddox, but he didn't respond. Maddox stepped forward, his patience running thin. "If you want to survive, you'd better start talking. Who's behind this?" The rider's lips curled into a defiant grin. "You'll see soon enough. There's no running from them." Emma's hand tightened around the rifle, but she didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she turned away, her face hardening. "We're done here." With that, they left the rider behind, the weight of the situation still pressing on their shoulders. They had made it through, but Maddox knew this was only a temporary victory. The real fight was just beginning. And as they disappeared into the forest, the storm continued to rage above them. A reminder that their battle wasn't over. It was only just starting.